The truth in reconciliation begins with an honest understanding. Indigenous people owned this land long before Canada existed. The country was built on top of that ownership. And today we're still dealing with the consequences of the Crown's failure to act honorably over the centuries. If Canada had upheld its promises and treated Indigenous nations with justice from the start, these matters would not be as complex and unresolved as they are now.
As Canada and as Canadians, we actually have to make some choices. Either Canada is a country where there used to a long time ago be Indigenous people who had some interesting stories and somehow or other they magically disappeared and the country just moved on after they disappeared and anything they owned disappeared. There are countries that operate on that basis. I suppose we could think of Canada as a country that occupies a space after the conquest of other peoples. We have some close neighbors who operate on exactly that basis. Or we can, one of the other options is we can actually have a country in which we live up to the rules that we actually set up at the time, and that those rules said we are all here. And that the Supreme Court has reminded us, not only are we all here, we're all here to stay.
So now that they have a modern treaty relationship, they're implementing their modern treaty, they don't have to ask the Crown. They could just move those logs and they can sell them. And they actually bought into the TFL in that area. And it's created all these opportunities for their nation. They know that modern treaty is a relationship, but it's also a journey. It's not a one and done. It is about how are they going to live with each other in their region, making local decisions for the betterment of their people, working with the city of Port Alberni, working with British Columbia on some issues, working with Canada on some of their issues. And, and he was always very proud to share that, because not only did they revitalize, their forestry industry, control over forestry, but they've revitalized their entire community where they're able to provide a living wage for their citizens. Anyone who wants a job can have a job. They have like 98% employment rate. That is huge. And again, for those that cannot participate in the labor market for whatever reason, they have extra resources to take care of them. They're not reliant on social services or grants that come in.
Go to your local library and ask them what they've got. And more importantly, if they tell you don't have a whole lot, ask them why not. This is the journey in reconciliation. Like I said, I didn't get 15 minutes of education on Indigenous, and Celeste has reminded me, and I've talked about this in a bunch of my speeches, probably half of that was about Riel, and the thing that I remember is that they hanged him at the end, right? Like that was seen as a good thing in the classroom story that, you put up a rebellion against the government, we'll hang you, and we'll teach everybody. That was what I learned about Indigenous growing up in this country all the way through university.
Hi everyone, my name is Amir Alavi, and this is the Policy Lab on our fourth episode. And today we're going to be joining with Celeste Haldane and Daniel Quan-Watson. Today's topic is also about reconciliation, and this is something close to my heart because I've been dealing with this topic throughout my master's degree and also for my capstone project. So to introduce, joining us today is Celeste Haldane, the Chief Commissioner of the BC Treaty Commission, now on her third term. She's a Musqueam and Metlakatla, a King's Counsel lawyer with over 25 years of experience in Indigenous law and governance. And she's also serving on several boards, including YWCA Vancouver. And we're also joined today by Daniel Quan-Watson, a former senior public servant with over 15 years as Deputy Minister, known for his leadership in Crown-Indigenous relations and his role in landmark agreements like the Niska Final Agreement. And he's the first Deputy Minister of Chinese Canadian descent, a strong advocate for inclusion and outside of work. He's a pilot and motorcycle enthusiast as well. And before we start, I also want to say that I'm recording this session on the unceded territories of the Musqueam Nation, the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and also the Squamish Nation. So with that being said, Celeste, why don't you go ahead, and if there's anything you want to add, and also Daniel for your introduction to you.
Aichka, it's Goyle. I'm joining you from this Nanaimo territory today, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation around Crown-Indigenous relations, looking at the future of what reconciliation can offer British Columbians and Canadians, and really just grateful to be joined by such an esteemed panelist as well. And I really look forward to our conversation. So thank you.
Daniel?
I'm really looking forward to the conversation too. Thank you very much for the invitation here, and wonderful to be here with Celeste, who has such a long history of doing extraordinary work that people are going to benefit from for generations to come. And maybe I could just comment on the fact I'm in Treaty 6 territory today and home of the Métis Nation of Alberta. And one of the reasons it's important that we talk about that, and we're talking about reconciliation between non-Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples in Canada today. When I grew up and went through some of Canada's best primary, secondary, and post-secondary education systems in this country, I probably spent a total of less than 15 minutes learning about Indigenous peoples. And not 1 second of that 15 minutes was spent being taught from an Indigenous perspective or by Indigenous peoples. And what I was taught essentially as a non-Indigenous person growing up in this country was that Indigenous people were an interesting historic artifact. They didn't exist anymore. Their histories, their realities weren't really a part of anything that I needed to be thinking about. And so there was no need to recognize that they were present, that they were part of the history of this country, part of the present of this country, and part of the future of this country. And so 10 years ago, we wouldn't even have said those words. And over the last 10 years, we've gotten very used to it, but it means something really deep. And what it means is that we are remembering that there was something that most of us grew up not hearing about even once, is actually a really important part of our shared journey. And so I thank you for making that remark. Celeste would always have done that. I suspect that's part of her tradition, but it's something that's even new to me in the last 10 or 20 years. And I am reminded every time I hear it what a gap it is between what we know and understand now and what I grew up with as a complete and total blank in what the best educational systems and institutions in this country thought fit to teach me.
You wrapped up the entire podcast in that one short introduction that you had. I don't know what to add at this point, but let's just get into it. I really appreciate everything you said, Daniel. So as you correctly mentioned, one of the objectives that I had for this episode was to have a bridge between Indigenous and non-Indigenous perspectives to deepen the understanding of what it actually is about. And then we will definitely talk about new policy directions to empower Indigenous self-determination. And, one thing that I also want to talk about is that some people, they don't understand the word unceded definition, and then how this can actually, this episode can help us understand what we really want to achieve with reconciliation and push the conversation beyond, compliance toward collaboration. So By that, what I know is many people think that, consent, or what we know as free, prior, informed consent, is more like a checkbox that different proponents they have to go through. That's not what it's supposed to be. So we'll talk about some of the recent barriers and challenges regarding that. So to start, what I want to know is what truth and reconciliation means to each of you. That's number one. And number two is, what does a complete process looks like? So let's say 20 years from now, what does or how does a reconciled Canada look like? And can we have a shared narrative regarding what reconciliation can be about? And that's a big, big goal. I know that because even within Indigenous communities, they might have a different understanding of what reconciliation means to their own, uh, First Nation. So why don't you start there, Celeste, and I'll go with Daniel for next.
Wow. Okay. So, really wanting to pick up on Daniel, what you said around acknowledging place and time and connection to land, because that's really, really important. Um, and you're right. I remember in my social studies, probably grade 10, there was maybe a sentence, and it was about Louis Riel, which had no specific relation to where I was in that time in the school system. So I absolutely agree that we've had a tremendously missed opportunity to educate Canadians about our shared journey as coming into a country. I mean, there's just so much history there that we have written off for so many years, so to speak, right? So back to unceded. I know that that becomes, in some instances, a lightning rod for some Canadians because they don't understand. Like, and what about land back? Like, what does this actually mean? And there's many different pathways to say land back, and that's what self-determination is all about. It's about reconciling our shared histories as British Columbians and Canadians, acknowledging how the country was formed, recognizing the Indigenous participation in the growth of our country and the welcomeness of First Nations across Canada. In British Columbia, our circumstances are a little bit different given that we have a very unique and troubled history when it comes to treaty negotiations. So that's going to be another important step and journey for those that are in the negotiations process. And but also recognizing that there's space for each nation to become self-determining in a vision and a way that they see fit for themselves. That's what self-determination is all about. And then with the latest decision that came out from the BC Supreme Court around the Couching case, so you have some issues around private land ownership, and that's where you're going to see a lot of industry, businesses, cities, top of the First Nations that are in the arena. And of course, I'm not going to profess to be an expert when it comes to this case, but that's going to bring about those other difficult conversations around what is the role of government and industry in reconciliation, as well as supporting self-determination. But on the other hand, you're going to end up with those that are fear-mongering, going, oh no, now private lands are on the table and this was never supposed to be. And so I think that's going to be an interesting conversation in the next few years as this case moves forward, but also as nations continue to move forward with their pathway to self-determination. And I think about some of the static, for lack of a better word, that was created when Haida was negotiating their title through legislation. And there was a lot of fear mongering from politicians, from local government around, well, what does this mean? Like, what's going to happen to me? So, I think bridging the gap through conversation is going to be the most integral component to advancing reconciliation. Not everyone's going to agree, but we have to have those conversations because, again, back to Daniel, what you were mentioning, it's about education and it's about an opportunity to sit down and reconcile our shared history, but also reconciling what Indigenous nations, what their pathway forward looks like. And it's not to the exclusion of others. And I think that's the other really component as well. It's not to the exclusion of others, even though we were excluded for so long in our country's development.
That was so good. Now, Daniel, if you don't mind, I want to reframe the question for you a little bit because this is something that has a little bit of history from what both you and I actually talked. So for my capstone project, I want to share a little bit of like memory that we had. You were the very first person that accepted to talk to us as a group. And one of the biggest takeaways that I had from that conversation that we had was like, I mean, you cannot really achieve everything that you want in like 1 year. We've been doing this for a very long time. This is not going to be happening for you in 1 year. So you have to see this as what it is, as a project. You have to define what your goal is and then try to make that little steps toward that goal. Now, let's bring that mindset again here and say that complete process of the project that there might be out in terms of reconciling between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canada. What does that look like?
And I'll probably go a long roundabout way answering that. And I think the first thing is to not think of it as a project. Peace, order, and good government, which is a foundation of our Constitution, isn't a project, right? You couldn't gather up 500 of the brightest, most capable Canadians, say you've got 18 months to figure out peace, order, and good government, and then we're never going to talk about that again. It's done. You couldn't say about human rights and the rights that are found in the Charter for every single Canadian, say, well, listen, give me a decade, we will settle that, but when we're never talking about it again because it's done. Nor would we say about things like poverty reduction. Well, let's have a period of time and then we'll be done, finish over in that, and we'll move on to other things and never talk about it again. I think the word unceded is actually a really good entry point into this conversation. So one of the things to realize, because a lot of people talk about this, and I've talked to journalists who talk about treaty negotiations as governments giving land to First Nations people. And that is a very predictable outcome of the way that most of us were raised to think about this country. But what that goes against isn't just an understanding of the way that the history played out. It goes against some of the raw facts of the rules that the Crown set up in the first place. So what is often at stake in these questions isn't simply the Crown had a set of rules, played fair and square by that set of rules, and other people wish the rules were different. What almost every single major land title case and Indigenous rights case has brought forward is this is the set of rules that the Crown set up in the first place. And what First Nations and Inuit and Métis people have been saying is we are demanding that you, the Crown, follow the rules that you set up. So let's go way back to 1763, when basically the British was the only European power with any significant holdings in North America. There was a proclamation, and that proclamation, set by the King, said, unless it is the Crown that is dealing with Indigenous people, none of their rights are affected. That's the Crown setting that rule. And here's the thing. If you're in your house and somebody tries to sell your house or set up a bedroom in your house or whatever else, you're going to go to a lawyer like Celeste or some other lawyer, and that lawyer is going to look at your land title, and that land title is going to say, hey, this is so-and-so's house, not the other person's house, and you're going to look at the land title to do that. And every single British Columbian, every single Canadian that has ever gotten a mortgage or ever tried to sell a house or tried to live there and enjoy it relies fundamentally on that certificate. So the way the common law works is that all land in Canada, or almost all land in Canada, is held on the basis of a Crown grant. It's held on the basis that the Crown owned it first. Now, if you're in the UK, that kind of makes a lot of sense. There's a long history of wars and conquests and all sorts of other things that say that that is why the crown owned everything, and then it saw fit to give it to different people or sell it to different people. But here's one of the questions that almost never gets asked when you go to visit your lawyer on the day that you're trying to pick up the keys to get your new condo or your new house. They'll show you that land title certificate and it'll say, yeah, Amir, that's really in your name now, or Daniel or Celeste. But what almost no one will ever tell you, but how did it get into the Crown's hands in the
The
first
first place.
place so that you could have your name on that title? And in the world that I grew up in, that was never even a question. I'll bet to a lot of people listening to this podcast, that seems like a really weird question. But here is an example of what reconciliation is about. Is what does it mean to come from a multi-generational history? Or what does it come from an understanding of just having plunked down $500,000, $1 million, $2 million for a land title, and never once having had to think about how that land got into the Crown's hands in the first place? Versus growing up in a community where that has always been the question. And there's always been a strong, clear view of the rules of the crown that don't match up with that decision. And so, to Celeste's point about the conversations we need to have, I don't know what the answer is in a bunch of those cases, but it cannot not be a question. It's a real question. It's a real question based on the rules that the Crown set up. The Crown said you can't just dispose of these rules. The Crown said it's the common law rules that apply. And starting particularly with the case in British Columbia known as Calder, it said, you know what? A bunch of those rights survived. A bunch of those rights didn't just disappear and fall into a great pit somewhere never to be seen again. They're around. And then we got progressively more cases over decades that said, yeah, here's another right that survived. Here's another right survived. These aren't things that are popping up out of nowhere. These are things that were always there. In fact, the very existence is proven on the fact that they had existed all this time and never went away. And so the world of reconciliation is in part about coming to terms with, okay, what do these things mean? But it means that we have to get rid of this notion that I had drilled into my head again and again and again that I would have failed every test that I ever took in social studies if that said the correct answer to the question of who founded Canada, there were not 3, not 10, not 50, but there were 2 founding peoples that created Canada, the English and the French. That's what I was taught. Indigenous was never mentioned at all, except by the very Crown that made the rules in the first place. The Crown said, yes, they do exist. Said, yes, those rights exist. Yes, the laws that apply to dealing with them will be the same laws that apply to everybody else in this country coming out of the common law. And if you didn't follow the processes of the common law to deal with that, then those rights continued to exist. So we have to have that conversation. We have to have that same conversation till there's no more Canada, in the same way that we still have to have the conversation about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, about equality rights, about all peace, order, and good government, about all of those things that are part of Canada's fabric. Now, what's a better place? Where do I want to be in 20 years? I want to be to a place where it is a first instinct to go and ask those questions. I want to be a place where we have the trust in place that people expect that we will actually have civil conversations and constructive conversations about where to go. That people won't come from it from a perspective that this is sort of a nuisance set of requests or that somebody wants me to give something else. This is a question about what was always intended in the first place as we established this country, regardless of whether or not we chose to ignore that for 150 years.
That was really good, and As you were explaining this, it was actually a learning moment for myself too, because maybe the word reconciliation in my head, and by the way, English is my second language, so it feels like two things coming together and being reconciled. That's the understanding that I had. So thinking about the word itself, it felt like there will be an ending point where there is a reconciled Canada, and that was the origination of the question, rather. I want to read you something that I found on Salem's Substack regarding the coalition's allies and Canada's case that we talked about. It says the truth and reconciliation begins with an honest understanding. Indigenous people owned this land long before Canada existed. The country was built on top of that ownership. And today we're still dealing with the consequences of the Crown's failure to act honorably over the centuries. If Canada had upheld its promises and treated Indigenous nations with justice from the start, these matters would not be as complex and unresolved as they are now. And this, you know, adding it to what you said, it was as you could see in my face, I was like, wow, yeah, now it makes sense much more. The second question I have in this segment is reconciliation for the benefit of Indigenous people alone, or one that all Canadians should see as one thing that brings us together in a continuous path for Canada in the future? So the way that I could reframe this is this a benefit? Is this truth and reconciliation something that we can see benefits also for non-Indigenous people in it, or this is something that it's merely brought to us for the benefit of the Indigenous people? So Celeste, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. And absolutely for the benefit of all. You know, as Daniel was walking us through the path of Confederation and the outstanding land question that we have, especially here in British Columbia, it is about, so truth is about the truth telling. And, you know, those reports are generally written for the broader public to have an understanding of what transpired. I mean, talking about the rule of law, we're talking about the rules that the colonial government set up, the Crown, and then having those rules changed and adjusted by through certain actors. Like I just particularly think about, you know, the terms of union of British Columbia joining Canada, and then us having, you know, certain governors that were continuously whittling away at land grants that were provided to First Nations, right? So that's bad policy. And that policy and those policies have continued to exist. And I think, like, for instance, the Indian Act. The Indian Act is, as we all know, patriarchal, colonial, but it's still a law that applies. And it applies to those that are entitled to be registered as status Indians. That controls our daily life. And those were used as the controlling mechanism once we were moved out of sight, out of mind. Then there's these other different goalposts that were put around First Nations on reserves, continuing to change policy through the heavy hand of the Indian Act. And that was for the betterment of other Canadians. That was for the betterment of immigration and settlement in Canada. Wasn't to the betterment of us, because as we go through our history, you know, you end up with laws being enacted. So First Nations weren't able to get lawyers. We weren't able to vote in any election up until, well, unless you enfranchise, but that's a whole different discussion. Weren't allowed to vote, so we had no democratic voice in a country that was built on our traditional territories, as well as you know, sending our children off to residential schools. So again, that was to break the familial ties and the amount of damage that residential schools have had on our communities, on our language, on our culture. I mean, even our culture was banned. We weren't even allowed to practice our culture. we weren't allowed to go to the big house or the long house or the sweat lodges because, again, that's another control mechanism that the government put into place. And it was about, creating space to settle Canada, to exploit resources that once belonged to us. It was about pushing away those that have rights, as much as the Crown thought that those rights were extinguished at the staking of the flag. So in Confederation, as well as, there was all these other control mechanisms that were put into place to keep us out of sight, out of mind, thumb on us, so we couldn't continue to practice our culture, couldn't speak language, could not speak language in residential schools. There was severe abuse for speaking your own language. There's incidences that I know of family members that had knitting needles stuck through their tongues because they were speaking their mother language. And it was about assimilation because Canada at the end wanted everyone to be one law for all, which is not, we don't even live in that scenario right now because we have the Indian Act is for one, but not for all. Although the Charter of Rights and Freedom is supposed to be for all, but which it is. But so those are some of the truths that need to be shared and told to gain an understanding as to some of the issues that our communities have faced and continue to face. It's because of colonization. It's not about, well, I pulled my bootstraps up, so you should too. Well, there's a lot of trauma that goes into the experiences that First Nations people, Métis and Inuit, have had through this process of building a country. And to think about it, over 150 years, there's been a lot of damage done, but also there's a lot of resilience. And that's the part that I see around reconciliation. So looking forward, the resiliency of our communities, the fact that our communities continue to survive and thrive and are able to practice culture. Our children are learning our language. I don't speak my language, so I'm very, I always like to hear that other people speak, 2, 3, 4 languages. I think that's incredible and it's amazing. And I encourage that. And also, I recognize that the history of Canada, we have some awful parts of history to share, again, shared history. But I also recognize that, we are a multicultural country and we embrace different cultures and different sets of people. And I think that's what really makes us rich as a country as well. And it's about lifting each other up, not about what's different or you're different or this, that. It's about how are we going to build our country to move forward? And particularly at a time where we have all these geopolitical influences that are influencing decision making. I'm sure we'll get into that a little later. But that's a part of what I see as reconciliation, is us walking a path together, sharing in prosperity. But again, ensuring that Indigenous nations have the ability to make their own decisions, to be free of the Indian Act if that's what they so choose to do so, to move forward in, BC, and the process that I'm involved in and Danielle was involved in is around, creating that new treaty relationship, which is to reset the relationship, to move forward together as partners with Canada and British Columbia, not, being forced into a relationship. This is a negotiated and agreed to relationship. And I think it's very important that Daniel mentioned the Calder case, because that really set and opened up the doors for what Aboriginal people, First Nations people, Indigenous people have been saying since Confederation, that we have rights. We are linked to our land and our territory, yet we were excluded from the Privy Council. That was the only place we could go. We were excluded from going to the League of Nations before it was the United Nations. And now we have more avenues for us to reset this relationship in a good way, with a strong foundation, with the ability to make decisions over lands and resources. And it's not to the exclusion of others. We're doing this jointly, but there needs to be that recognition that we do have title. Title is not perfected, and the courts have said that. And so the best thing to do is sit down and negotiate with the Crown. And that's what we support and facilitate. I know that's a lot for people to take in,
Yes,
but it's about education and
yes.
learning to live with each other.
Just for me to understand, when you say that the titles are not perfected, what does that actually mean in simple terms?
What Daniel said around, us going to buy, I have a fee simple house. I go to the land title office. I have my certificate. The only underlying burden on my fee simple title is the fact that the Crown has mineral interests living in Nanaimo. There's also, they can't guarantee the fact that I might not be on an old coal mine shaft, and so they don't take any responsibility for that because this was a coal mining town. But that's what that means. And so back to the original question that Daniel mentioned, where we should all be asking is, whose land was this before? How did the Crown get their title? How did they get their grant? How did they get that piece of paper? And in some instances, it's through treaty making. But in British Columbia, it's way more complicated because we don't have a lot of treaties.
True. Daniel, go on the second question. So, is this for the benefit of the Indigenous people, or you see paths where non-Indigenous people and everyone can benefit from this? So go on.
Yeah, I think that answer to that question happens at a mechanical level, but it happens also at a much more important level. Because as Canada and as Canadians, we actually have to make some choices. Either Canada is a country where there used to a long time ago be Indigenous people who had some interesting stories and somehow or other they magically disappeared and the country just moved on after they disappeared and anything they owned disappeared. There are countries that operate on that basis. I suppose we could think of Canada as a country that occupies a space after the conquest of other peoples. We have some close neighbors who operate on exactly that basis. Or one of the other options is we can actually have a country in which we live up to the rules that we actually set up at the time, and that those rules said we are all here. And that the Supreme Court has reminded us not only are we all here, we're all here to stay, and that we believe the rule of law is important, and that history means that, and the rule of law means that we have to solve these issues through working with each other. We can work with each other in the courts, as referred to in a particular case, or we can work with each other in the way that Celeste is working so hard to do, which is to work these things through in ways that are agreeable and acceptable to the representatives of everybody that's there. And so you asked the question about, is it to the benefit of everybody or some? Is Canada a better country, a worse country that women are allowed to be seen as legal persons or not? Because they used to not be. Is that only to the benefit of women, or is the fact that I can go to a doctor that's female and not have to wait till half the number of available graduates who are male graduate? The fact that I can have brilliant scientists or police officers or military people protecting me who are female, is that just a benefit to them because they have a job, or am I benefiting from that because I'm protected by them? Because it wasn't always the case. Up until the time my mother was born, a lot of women got automatically fired the moment they got married. So am I in a better position because there are married women who can provide all of the business and societal services that are a core part of a successful country, or am I better off without that? Is that only the benefit to those women or to me? There are countries in this world where if you immigrate to that country, you are expected to forget and lose every single piece of your former identity and accept the national identity as it's dictated to you by some group that is already there. Is that benefiting only one group or another, or is the shape of that country different because of the choices you make? And so it's easy to say, well, in a land question or in a financial question or in a program or a governance question or a park opening or closure question, who's benefiting from it? But when you step back from that and ask, well, what's the alternative? Those are the choices that we actually have to make. And I don't think the history, and I certainly don't believe the future that should belong to Canada, is one of Canada being a nation that is built on the basis of conquest. It's also not based on the magical disappearance of people who were here and were critical parts of founding this country. I was the CEO of Parks Canada, and Fort George sits right opposite the Niagara Gorge. And on the other side of that is an American fort. The Americans invaded Canada there in 1812. When the Americans retreated, it wasn't because they were worried about 20 redcoats and a bunch of Canadian farmers turned militia people. It's because they heard the Mohawks were coming. And they weren't going to stand and face the Mohawks. And they went south of the river and they stayed there ever since. And that means something, that history, that the Mohawks in that particular case were critical parts of defining Canada as what we know. So I'm not in favor of a country that doesn't recognize the history and the rules that it set itself up on and the rule of law that goes with that, because I think a country that is absent the rule of law is not the Canada that I want to be a part of. But in the instances, the more mechanical ones, and I think Celeste is quite right to raise this, who benefits when Indigenous students, learners, children are well educated? Well educated because they have a program that doesn't talk in Vancouver Island or in British Columbia about Riel without talking about the realities of the people from their own background.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have better learners who don't have needles stuck through their teeth, or do we have better learners when needles are stuck through their teeth for speaking the language of their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents? Because the system that we're trying to put in place is one that doesn't stick needles in people's tongues. It's one that doesn't make the decisions about these things in places that don't even know the people and the populations involved. What it does what every single other school board in this country does, everywhere else in this country already and has since Confederation. It says that the local people are going to actually figure out many of the key elements that matter most to them. And so are we in a better country when we say that the thing that works for everybody else, which is local involvement and control and whatever, should apply only to some people, but definitely not to other people, and that those other people should have those decisions made by somebody on the seventh floor of an office tower in Ottawa, 3,000 kilometers away? I guess the answer, the question on that is, if you think that all of those things that I'm painting here as negative are actually better for Canada, then you could make the argument, I suppose, in that context that, it only benefits in one particular direction. But I think we're a better country when the principles that we have decided upon, which is that the people who are most affected directly by decisions about how to educate their children, how to deal with their children if they're needing care, how to protect culture, language, are made by people who actually understand those things, then I think that benefits everybody in this country. And I guess what I would say to anybody who thinks that, no, it should be people who don't know and aren't connected to those things, who should be making those decisions. My question is, well, when are you going to vote to get rid of your local school board and get somebody several provinces away to decide what's best for your children's school?
I think most of the root cause of this particular question of seeking the benefit, like who's getting the benefit, it's because of the proximity that we have to the United States, because the understanding that we have right now is somebody is benefiting here and that's not me, and then maybe that's the model that is more, let's say, economically or financially prosperous, is the United States. We see it, why don't we do the same thing? But then, as you correctly mentioned, Daniel, is actually have examples that we can relate to here in Canada, for example, the school board, we decided locally, we don't, you know, externalize it to somebody in like thousands of kilometers away. And we have to focus on who we are and what we are in Canada rather than what, other nations have done. So to the next point, and I want to be mindful about the time. We're going to go for another 8 minutes. So this is going to be big topic, but we'll try to fix it in that time. If you're ready to go further, we can go further than that. So it's about the barriers and challenges that we deal with when it comes to reconciliation. So what are the key legal, institutional, and social barriers to a meaningful reconciliation? Celeste, I'm sure you have a lot to contribute to this question. So please go on. And also one thing, at some point, if you can briefly explain the differences between co-management and treaty and things like that, that would be great. So go on.
Wow. Okay. So I assume some of this conversation will take place after the break because I would like to get into more of the treaty discussion and co-management.
Sure.
Because I think that's going to be a really good, fulsome conversation. And of course, Danielle, with your experience, especially with parks, Crown-Indigenous relations, I think that will be a very rich conversation. But back to the question around barriers and institutional barriers. As I mentioned earlier, the Indian Act is a barrier. It always has been a barrier for those First Nations who have reserves. We've been confined to very small parcels of land, particularly in Vancouver, that are not usable, really. And then that was by design. And if we look at our history in British Columbia in particular, by design through people like Joseph Trutch, others that came in to, again, take lands away and continue to erode lands and to ensure that better lands for settlement were given, because there was this concept that when immigration was happening and settlement was happening in Canada, that we didn't use and utilize the land in the same way as those that were coming from the UK and other countries, that we were not agrarian. We had no concept of how to, develop our land and make money from the resources. So there was that it was really racist. I mean, let's just call it what it is. There was a lot of racist ideology where we were thought of as savages and couldn't develop, because that's what really they wanted to happen across the country. We wanted settlement and we wanted to extract resources. And that's, what they're used to in their own countries. So the Indian Act has become a barrier for a number of reasons and through a variety of ways for economic prosperity and being able to, back to co-management. It's hard to do on a reserve. And maybe I'll just even sort of try to simplify it a little bit more. First Nations or treaty nations that have reserve lands, they don't even own the land. It's the Queen or the Crown. Now it's the King. So they don't even own the land. They don't have an inescapable economic component to a reserve land because it's held in trust, because we're wards of the Crown, where there's a fiduciary obligation for us to be taken care of through the reserves. And that's can become a barrier. And back to what Danielle was mentioning around someone making decisions in Ottawa from the 7th floor. And I've been in that building many, many times. And I often joke about the color of the building, but that's a whole different story. So that's someone making a decision in Ottawa around what we can and cannot do on our little reserve land. And so I'll provide a perfect example around how treaty relationships and modern treaties have changed that. And I'll defer to previous commissioner, Tom Happynook, who's from Coyet, hereditary chief. And he always tells a story around 2008, and maybe you weren't here in 2008, but we had a big windstorm, big storm that knocked down all the trees.
I came to Canada in 2008. So
okay, so Stanley Park.
Yeah.
Well, There's a big windstorm, knocked down a bunch of trees in Stanley Park. Well, Hawaiian, where they're located in Banfield on Vancouver Island, they also had a windstorm. And so they had trees that were falling down that landed all over the beach. Now, this is before they had a treaty, so they're still under the Indian Act. They actually had to ask permission to move those logs from the beach up to the reserve. They also do not have the ability to sell those logs because they have to get permission from the Crown in Ottawa, from the government of Canada. That's the Indian Act. So now that they have a modern treaty relationship, they're implementing their modern treaty. They don't have to ask the Crown. They could just move those logs and they can sell them. And they actually bought into the TFL in that area. And it's created all these opportunities for their nation. They know that modern treaty is a relationship, but it's also a journey. It's not a one and done. It is about how are they going to live with each other in their region, making local decisions for the betterment of their people, working with the city of Port Alberni, working with British Columbia on some issues, working with Canada on some of their issues. And, and he was always very proud to share that, because not only did they revitalize, their forestry industry, control over forestry, but they've revitalized their entire community where they're able to provide a living wage for their citizens. Anyone who wants a job can have a job. They have like 98% employment rate. That is huge. And again, for those that cannot participate in the labor market for whatever reason, they have extra resources to take care of them. They're not reliant on social services or grants that come in, every month to pay. They're able to provide their citizens with extra that they wouldn't be able to do beforehand. And I think that is seeing the strength of moving from the Indian Act, which has been a barrier for so many nations to move forward, into this new space where you have a modern treaty relationship. And also, part of the backstop to all of this is the many court cases that Daniel mentioned too, because that has created and shaped how First Nations, Indigenous nations, Métis and Inuit participate in the economy as well. And so we are moving away from those, confined relationships. However, you see it really successfully done with those modern treaty nations. And I just wanted to also acknowledge Nisga'a, given the fact that they've been implementing 25 years. They just bought, like, part of in a joint partnership, a port in the area, so they're able to ship critical minerals our economy relies on. They're in control, and that's huge. I mean, Haisla, also First LNG, they've had
Speaking of
6
benefits,
ships
by
up,
the way.
right? And that's about self-determination and allowing governments to be governments and control at the local level and make sure that they're meeting the needs of their people. But also, it's about everyone around them. And I think that's a testament to a good relationship and a good partnership.
What are the challenges of just getting rid of Indian Act? If that is like one of you mentioned this is like one of the biggest challenges that you had to deal with. Is there any specific reason that it's still there while it's actually a challenge to that level that even moving logs was an issue?
Yes. Well, this is another interesting. I think we should talk about this one after, because I know BC, we have a bit of a different perspective than the rest of the country, and some of the conversation and dialogue is that if you look at the numbered treaties, they're rooted in the Indian Act continues to exist. They have reserves, whereas in the modern treaty scenario, so from 1973 onwards, the Indian Act falls away because they have self-governing powers. And I think that's the interesting conversation. And some are just hanging on to the Indian Act. Me, I would like to see a day where I do not have my number and I have a reconciliation card or a treaty card or whatever we want to call it at Musqueam, but that I no longer have my Indian status number attached to me.
Daniel, I wanna ask the same question from you, but if you think that it's better to take a break, we can go there, or you're on mute.
Great. Yeah, sorry. I'm happy to answer now,
Perfect.
if that works for you.
Yes.
I think Celeste has said it very well, and the very simple summary, like there's no single tool as such, maybe the Indian Act, but it's the effective removal in almost every system we have over the vast majority of our history as a country and provinces of completely excluding Indigenous people from any decision making at all. And so you could do enormous things that would have huge impacts on traditional food sources, fishing, hunting, whatever it was, and have exactly zero conversations with people who were suffering catastrophic effects from those losses of food. You could make decisions about the language a community could speak without ever once talking to the communities involved, except to tell them that now what they were doing was illegal. You could sort of run entire economies without ever involving people. You could make enormous social decisions without ever involving First Nations, Métis, or Inuit people in this country through vast swaths of territory, including literally right in people's backyards. And so when you set up a process like that, it doesn't work very well. There isn't a provincial government in the history of this country that hasn't argued that they've been held back by the federal government making decisions that affect them without giving the provincial government adequate voice in it. I'm not here to say whether or not those arguments are right or wrong, but there has never been a provincial government in the history of this country that hasn't said that the federal government has made decisions in ways that made it impossible for the province to achieve its full potential. Well, let's expand that then to Indigenous people who, through the vast bulk of this country's history, have had exactly zero say in the building of a lot of the institutions that govern and make decisions, and where, in many instances, inside those institutions, the knowledge and experience of engaging with those First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, if you look going back to the 1867 mark or something similar to that, almost all of that capacity is concentrated maybe in the last 25 years, and in a lot of cases, much more recently than that. That entire dynamic makes it very difficult to make those decisions. So I live in a part of the country where there are a lot of reserves here in Alberta along a lot of highways. So a lot of what they want to do is exactly what Celeste described. We want to have employment for our community members. Makes a huge difference in terms of language, culture, retention, all of those things, because people don't move away because they have to move away. Has an enormous impact on safety and security. We have lived through the national inquiry on murdered and missing Indigenous women, and much of that is related to the way people feel that they can treat Indigenous women and girls when they're outside of their home communities and when they're transiting different places. So to have employment and have the ability to stay in those communities has a profound impact. If you were a municipal government anywhere and take 7 or 8 years to decide whether or not a gas station goes up, you lose the next election. You lose it within 2 years or 3 years or whatever the cycle is for those elections. But the way the decision making works in a whole bunch of these cases on reserve is that it goes to a pile at a department, and it gets dealt with along with all of the other questions from all of the other reserves across the entire country. And the impact that not having a generation of high school graduates actually be able to stay at home because there's employment there is never something that is capable of driving the timing and nature of those answers. And the people who are making the decisions have no direct relationship to those communities in so many cases in the way that would be true for every single non-Indigenous neighboring community in that area. So it's another example of how there are tools and institutions and processes in place that create a barrier to having the same types of success that neighboring communities have. And so it becomes very easy for some people to say, well, it's because of whatever negative attributes they want to apply to that community. But I don't know any community that could survive if every single time somebody wanted to set up a new business in a new area, they had to go to a department in Ottawa and wait till every other business in Canada had its turn first before you got to the decision about whether or not you can have a gas station next door. And it's just one example.
Wow. Uh, we'll wrap it up here for the first part, but it feels like to me that, and we're going to talk about this after the break, that it feels like if we have the treaties right, that's going to offload so much work on the side of both, the federal and also the provincial government, so that they can actually do other stuff, and then decisions can be made locally rather than, as you mentioned, like one gas station being waited in queue with the rest of the uh, you know requests that are coming up. But we're gonna take a break, and now it's 12 o'clock. Uh, we'll be back in 10 minutes if that's okay. And we're gonna try to cover the challenges and barriers, and the next two segments. Hopefully, we can have just a little briefer responses so we can cover everything. But thank you so much.
Okay, well, I'll be back.
Yeah, we'll be back. Let's do it. One of the challenges that we have, you know what, before I go there, I'm gonna go back to Celeste, what you wanted to talk about, the co-management versus treaties and self-determination. So you go on, explain it to our viewers, the difference between these. So go on.
Okay, so quite a mixed bag, but in BC, I mean, we're talking about modern treaty and negotiations that our organization oversees, and we're an independent organization that oversees the facilitation of the negotiations between Canada, British Columbia, and First Nations in the province of BC. And so through that, we have 8 modern treaties. Of course, Niska was negotiated prior to the establishment of our process. However, what that encompasses is decision-making authority for First Nations, who are modern treaty nations. They're able to make decisions about their future, whether it be economic development, managing their lands and resources, language, culture, fisheries. That's another really important component to treaty negotiations here, especially on the West Coast, and having access to resources that we've had access to since time immemorial. So it's around managing a new relationship and resetting the relationship. And there are provisions of co-management, which means they're making decisions together as to how to access a particular resource. So fisheries is probably a really good example when we're looking at co-management. And some of the new treaties that have been initialed, so we've had 3, that was Comox, Kitsillas, and Kitsum-Kalim.
Mhm.
Comox Nation and Kitsillas their communities have ratified their treaties. Kitsum-Kalim is expected to go to vote November 1st. And what we're seeing in this new treaty relationship is the shared decision making. So there's actually a chapter around how the governments, because there's 3 governments now, how they're going to make decisions together around land management, about access to resources, economic development, capacity building. And so there's sort of the same, but they'll be operationalized and implemented a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that one aspect on how modern treaty nations will continue to build out their relationship, but also the self-determination and the fact that they're self-governing which means that they're able to make decisions a lot quicker than having to wait for Ottawa, as Daniel explained earlier. That can be, waiting for 633 other First Nations and you're at the bottom of the pile. Decision making is a lot quicker, as well as for private investment. There seems to be, the treaty sets out all the rules and regulations, so to speak, as to how decisions can be made. So it creates that certainty, which attracts investment, especially private investment in British Columbia. And so that's a really great point, because as we were talking earlier, some of the barriers can be access to capital for First Nations or Indigenous peoples across the country to engage in resource development or major projects. And so that has been a barrier for some nations. And so now we're seeing these barriers fall away and create that economic climate to invest. And we've seen that in Tsawwassen. We've seen that in Niska. Niska is moving forward with their pipeline as well, creating a tremendous amount of wealth for their citizens. But it's not just about their citizens. It's about everyone else in the region is benefiting from the economic certainty that is created, as well as the fact that you're creating careers. I think about Tsawwassen addressing local housing needs. As we know, we're in a housing crisis. Well, they've put, 10,000 plus units on the market just recently. And I mean, again, it's around how do we come up with local solutions to deal with local issues that benefits everyone? And that's what modern treaties can do and do. And then in the other aspect, or the other area where there's shared decision making and economic negotiations, directly with those nations that may not be in the treaty negotiations process. So they have a different set of negotiations. And again, this stems from court cases that have been won in the courts, where the Crown has a duty to consult on any projects. It's their fiduciary obligation. And that's where you find the province of British Columbia entering into a number of agreements and arrangements to create that short-term certainty so a project can move forward, whether it's logging or a new nickel mine going in or expanding another mine, as some examples in BC. But again, it's around creating that certainty. And there are economic benefits to nations that engage in these impact benefit agreements. So again, that's a different component of shared decision making. And I think I'll touch on HIDA and the reconciliation legislation, both provincially and federally. So this is where HIDA, and they've been in the courts and won several court cases around their rights, as well as if anyone's going to win the whole of Haida Gwaii title, that would definitely be them. So what they've decided to continue to pursue is title through recognition of their title through legislation. And there are components in there that there will be shared decision making. And they're negotiating those parameters right now with both Canada and British Columbia. They also recognize that they have to, again, deal with local issues and be good neighbors, just as we're good neighbors with everyone, that they'll continue to have that dialogue and conversation as they move through their negotiations with the citizens of their communities, but the citizens of Haida Gwaii, all of them. And so it's about bringing people along. So there's different ways to look at how shared decision-making and co-management is operationalized in a community. And again, it really does reflect the vision of the community and self-determination. And not every nation is going to have the exact same vision of self-determination, but they're going to do what's fit for them in their communities. And just wanted to provide some context as to why it's important, especially for our economy. But everyone benefits from economic reconciliation and the infusion of private investment and foreign investment into our economy. But also, I want to recognize is that a lot of First Nations are the major proponents of some of these projects. We've had 30 First Nations just recently buy a pipeline in British Columbia, and we're able to secure funding through the federal government through the major projects, which is excellent because there hasn't been a lot of economic investment in Indigenous communities, and here's another way that we're doing it.
One thing, just to make sure that I understand the difference. So, co-management or shared decision making, these are for short-term goals, let's say, versus a treaty. Did I get this right?
Well, a treaty is a longer it. I mean, a treaty is a
It's a
treaty,
treaty.
and there are provisions in there for co-management
Hmm.
and shared decision making. So those ones will last
So
a
these
lot
are
longer.
elements of,
Yes.
okay. So because what I was thinking was that has there been any previous agreements? And I think both of you can contribute to this. As has there been any previous agreements where when you're on the path of treaty negotiations, you see that this treaty doesn't, oh, sorry, this agreement doesn't really fit with the bigger picture of what you're trying to achieve, and then did that become an obstacle itself? And you had to deal with it. So this is something that it just came to me as a follow-up question.
I think Daniel would be able to chime in for sure. I've got my own thoughts, but he has direct experience.
You know, the way maybe that the analogy I'd use to maybe add a bit to what Celeste had said there, you know, somebody wants a place to live. You can do at least one of two things. You can rent or you can buy. And so, you know, there are co-management models that are the analogy of rental. You know, you have a 5-year agreement, and or it's, you know, for this particular one project or whatever it is that you set up the agreement. But, you know, maybe there's a provision in there that says one or either party can cancel it on 2 weeks' notice, or, you know, maybe it just ends after 5 years, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, depending which side of the agreement you're on, maybe there's a new chief and counsel, maybe there's a new corporate owner of the company. They decide, yeah, actually, we don't want to do that anymore. So
Mm.
it's done, right? Could last the whole term of its agreement, or maybe not. In treaties, you cannot simply unilaterally put an end to them. They will be there for as long as there is a Canada.
Hmm.
And so that to me is the big difference between the two. In the rental versus owning of a housing, you're still living in a house, right? In a treaty versus various other agreements, you're still talking to each other. You could call that co-management. You could call that any number of things, but you're still talking to each other about different issues. It's just the question of how clear are the rules and how permanent are the rules in those agreements. So when you ask the question, you know, are there people who said, well, you know, the previous agreement didn't really work for us, let's move to something else. Probably the best example of that is the move from Indian bands and tribal councils that were societies under the Societies Act of different provinces to actual governments. So one of the things that happens is many of the issues that the province and the federal government never touched at all or touched very little in the past, the First Nation government, or Inuit or Métis as the case might be, wants to delve heavily into that. And so they need an entity that can do that. And well, that was never going to be the Indian Act Band, and that was never going to be a tribal council that was simply set up as a society under the Societies Act. That needs a different model. And that's where, in a lot of cases in treaties, you know, they set up governments to do exactly those things. The earlier treaties, we didn't use the concept of governments, we used settlement corporations, and there's a bit of a history around that. But in British Columbia, certainly the modern treaties include governments.
One thing you notice, you mentioned, and it was a new thing to me, prior to recognizing First Nations as governments, they were incorporated under the Societies Act.
So there were two sets of things. There
That's
were
so
always Indian
limited.
Act bands, right? Since 1876, there was an Indian Act band, and it's a bit of a legal oddity in comparison to other entities, but it was a group that was out there. But I mean, the way bands often got created is there was a treaty commissioner or there was an Indian agent, and they found people wherever they found them. They made up a list and they said, well, you're in this band, you're in that band. And people said, yeah, but I was just visiting my grandmother. And the Indian agent said, I don't care. This is your band. And now you can't go back to where you were before. And there were all sorts of issues with that, right? Now, there are people, the First Nation peoples, who have multiple communities. The Niska were one. There were four major Niska communities. They were all Niska, but they lived in different places. They wanted to find a way to come together and push for common cause, Niska cause, not just the four individual communities. And so they had to have an entity to do that. The only way they could set up an entity that would be legally recognized, so enter into contracts to, hire somebody to receive funding, was under the Societies Act of British Columbia to create a society, the rough equivalent of a bowling club or something like that, was the only legal mechanism that existed that would allow First Nations in British Columbia and many other places to actually have some type of legal entity that could do this work. And you wouldn't trust a Societies Act entity with the education of your children or the move to try and get better sewage treatment plants or any number of other things. It's just not designed for that purpose. But that was the only thing that was available. So you asked that question earlier, what are some of the barriers? There's a classic example. It sounds very mundane, but what on earth would be if you had four neighboring communities that wanted to work together? What would the legal entity be that could receive that funding and operate in a way that would deal with those things? Because it sure isn't under the Indian Act.
And that's a really important point, because that's also a legacy in our process when we were first established, is that we had to have entities that could take in funding. And so a lot of societies were created just for that fact. But I wanted to circle back to Haida, because not only in the legislation, both provincially and federally, a Haida Nation is now the government. And so we have updated them as the government, and it states that right in their legislation. So they no longer need this society to accept funds because they're legitimately recognized as a government now. Ktunaxa Nation was the same instance where they had to set up a society in order to get funding, whether it be through the commission or other economic development funding. And they were also recognized as a government. And that was, I think, a really important step in the relationship and resetting the relationship between the Crown and Indigenous nations, to actually recognize who is the government and how are they going to engage in that way as governments. It's so very fascinating.
Yeah, when you just think again about the broader conversation of reconciliation, right? So you're Ktunaxa enough or you're Haida enough that an Indian agent can say you're not allowed to go to town, and say you can't sell fish, and say you can't vote.
So
it can say all those
someone can
things.
come to you and say you cannot go out of the IRs?
Well, it used to be the case, right? So and said you can't speak the language you want to speak. You can't choose where to send yourself. So you're Ktunaxa or you're Haida enough to be told that by the Indian agent. When it comes to maybe we'll give you a check to do this, that, or the other thing, we don't really know who you are, right? Well,
And who
sorry,
is
we
this
can't do
Indian
that.
agent that you're talking about? Is it from the community or it's like
No, it was a federal employee, and so it's a different role now. But in the days that up until the 60s, there were Indian agents that worked in individual communities, probably in fact up to the 1970s, and they held near absolute power on goings on in communities. they could tell you, no, you cannot go to town to sell hay.
Seems like a little shaw that you have in one, region or one area that can, report back to
It was a public servant.
how many people closed
Well,
down their routes. This is
yeah, often they didn't do a lot of reporting to a lot of people. There was very little recourse available, and that there's a long history to that. But to come back to Celeste's point, right? So yes, people had to set up these societies to receive the funding, but how insulting is that if you are those people who simply based on who your family was could be told you couldn't go to school, you couldn't go to town, you couldn't vote, all these other things, but suddenly when there's a benefit to be had, well, we're not really sure who you are.
forget about the insulting part, which is a very important part. If you're looking for a systematic suppression of anyone, education, economic, this is I'm not from any indigenous community. This is mind-blowingly making me furious that you stop someone to go out of an area and then
Yes,
coming back.
Yeah.
right.
How?
You had to get a pass a
Mhm.
lot of the times
Yeah.
if you're allowed out. And I'll, I can share a
This
couple
is
of
like
examples.
this is an example of segregation level that it's new to me. Like I did a capstone project on this issue of indigenous people and finding gaps in different jurisdictions in different acts and stuff. This is new to me. Like think about how many generations had to just dragged in that environment, and now they're behind. We just have to do something about this, both economically, education, and yes, the trauma that they had to go through for years and years and years.
But I'd love to hear the examples that Celeste was going to talk about.
Well, back to, restricting mobility, which was a huge one for women. And there's a couple of instances, if we married someone that was from another reserve, we were automatically stricken off of our home community and had to move to our husband's community. And then we were put on that ban list. And the other one is, and this is where a lot of my family is impacted, is that if status Indian woman married a non-status Indian,
They
she was
lose it. They lose their status.
yeah, they're kicked right off. And then there's the ripple effect because then the children aren't registered. And in an interesting scenario in my own family was that my late grandmother and my late grandfather, both full. My grandfather died in a tragic boating accident. My grandmother eventually married someone who was not Indigenous. Anyways, all of the kids, even though they're 100% because they're both Metlakatla and Musqueam, they were then also all disenfranchised. And it wasn't until 1985 through Bill C-31 that we were able to get our status back. But then there's a generation cutoff, which is me. I'm the last generation because my grandmother was reinstated, my late father was reinstated, and then I was. And so if my kids, if any of them are, they don't have enough Indigenous in them, the Indian Act will say, nope, you're no longer, you cannot be a status Indian. And that's what's happened in my instance. But I did find a bit of a loophole. my current husband is full, and he adopted my older two, and so they're registered through his band. But anyways, just saying the identity politics that goes along with it, who is and who isn't, and the Crown making those assessments through legislation. It's very confusing, and it's caused a lot of disruption, which it was anticipated. That's exactly what it was set up to do. But another example is, so back to restricting mobility and economic opportunities. My husband comes from Treaty 4, so farming, agrarian. there was instances where they were out farming their settler counterparts, and so the Indian agent would come in and just say, well, no, you can't go to town, you can't sell, you're done. And they then would restrict their access to the market, capital access, but also there was other provisions and punishments that were put into place as well. Food restrictions, deliveries to the reserve. You can't leave the reserve, everything has to be delivered to you. What better way to teach people a lesson than to cut off their
What's the
supply?
point? Like, yes, the mobility is limited. I think if you're a colonial power, I see the reasoning behind this, but it seems like if you're not allowing people to get their food, it seems like the plan was something else.
All they'll say is this, that
Like,
this
are
is
you
all
on
living
a
memory.
calorie regime? Sorry to interrupt you. Like, we have to deliver you food, and then there is like an inventory of food that is just for one set of period of time that you have, and then we deliver more after that?
Well, this was, to tie this back to co-management in whatever form that takes. All of these decisions stem from an absolute imbalance of power. None of these decisions were made after discussions with, or with the exception, or sorry, with the acceptance by the First Nations people involved. Similar things happened to Inuit, and there's a whole history with Métis as well. It was the absolute exclusion of First Nations people from all of these decisions. And we haven't gone into who decided the questions around who could do commercial fishing that ate into food sources for communities, or the decisions about natural resource projects that cut into the trapping livelihoods or the food sources by way of hunting or plant gathering for First Nations. That's why co-management. That's why engagement in decision-making processes, co-management is a term that effectively means engagement in decisions that have an impact or are likely to have an impact on some things that are fundamental to me, the future of my family, the future of my community, the future of my people. And that's what that's about. It's not an administrative nicety to build into a process. It is the response to the fact that we have had a history of completely excluding people from these decisions and many others that often have a profound impact on people. And again, this is all within living memory of community after community after community right across this country. And so when people bring the demands and the expectations that they will be involved in decisions that may have an enormous impact on them, this isn't a theoretical exercise that got dreamed up in a textbook. This is a response to lived histories that go up through some very, very, very recent times. And that, you asked the question earlier, who does it benefit? I guess the question is, does it benefit all of us if we're in a country where if the state is somehow or other either going to undertake an action or permit an action that is going to have an enormous impact on its citizens, should those citizens have the opportunity to express their views on that? And if they have rights that are there and recognized by the courts, should they have the opportunity to make sure that those rights are protected, or should people be allowed to simply run roughshod over them without even thinking or talking about them? And I'm of the view that a country that doesn't do the latter is a much better country to be in.
I agree. That was very well said. And that's, I guess, the really fundamental, important factor of making decisions together. So, there was a discussion or a mention of free, prior, informed consent. Well, that's a big part of co-management and co-decision making. It's also part of our judicial fabric because we've had legal cases that state that. Um, but it's about having the seat at the table and being heard. Those are two fundamental elements and two very important places to be when decisions are being made. As we've shared, there's been a long history of denialism. Denialism that Indigenous peoples exist, denialism that Indigenous peoples have rights and title, up until even when the courts are telling them, no, that's not the case. We still need to be at the table when really heavy decisions are being made about us. And that's what reconciliation to me also looks like, is being in all these different spaces and places to have Indigenous voices heard around anything that's going to impact their community, whether it's resource development. We've there's some massive pieces of legislation that has gone through both provincially and federally around major projects. And it's just around that commitment to engage, to consult, to work alongside each other, because that's what we should be doing and what should have been done from the outset. And, Indigenous peoples have been left out of the conversations for so long that now we're getting into the conversations. A lot of them are actually major economic development players, creating wealth and generating wealth for their communities, but also, again, generating wealth for all Canadians. And I think that's the other factor that's missed, is that we're not always here to say no. We want to hear what is happening because we haven't been at the table for a long time.
Uh, I was gonna ask the second question under the barriers and challenges, but I think the journey that we had, it requires us to also talk about uh, some of the hoaxes that we've heard when it comes to truth and reconciliation, and that truth part is the one that I want you to address. I'll give you examples of that. For example, land back means kicking everyone else out.
No.
Yeah.
No. Land back is, for some, there's some that they actually would like their territories back. Again, that's why there's negotiation tables for that to transpire. Some, it's about control. So back to what we were talking about with co-management, having a seat at that table. Do we have a role in the greater part of our territory? But it's not about displacing private interests. It's not about displacing the economy. It's about that recognition that we were here first. But also, we're all here to stay. So how are we going to move the conversation forward? And in some instances, we've had communities that were completely removed from their traditional territories because it was too inconvenient to govern them from Ottawa, right? So think about the
What happened to them?
displacement.
Has anyone asked, like, by the way, there was a community here. What happened to them?
Yeah. And so there were settlements, but I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that there's this ongoing connection to land that we have because it's part of our culture, it's part of who we come from. We have words for places and names, and it's about how do we share this land together? And then in some instances, how are we going to own and manage our own land is part of it. But it's not about displacing people. And it's about a conversation. And I think that's where it really was sparking some dialogue around, this is our shared history. You should at least learn about it and acknowledge it. You might not agree with it, but acknowledge it. It's same with giving land acknowledgements. For some reason, people find that, that's, and using the word unceded. Well, no, I hear arguments the other way. We staked the flag. You weren't here. it is what it is, right? But it's about having that conversation and educating the public.
Another common myth is that First Nation people don't pay taxes, get free housing, and entirely living off of government handouts.
Been on the housing list since 1995. I'm still number 40. No, I bought my own house. Yes, I pay taxes.
Good. So,
And I want
what's
to
the
come back.
root cause of these myths, by the way?
Well, I think let me go back to the first one, land back. Up until the Nunavut land claim came into effect, the Inuit of Nunavut, who were the only people who lived there, only like 100% of the people who lived there up until early parts of the 20th century, um, owned exactly nothing as a collective entity of that land, like exactly nothing. And if you look at British Columbia, the land question there of what Indigenous rights remain covers almost the entire province, if not the entire province. But if you look at the percentage of the land that Indigenous people are living on, it starts with sort of some zeros in terms of a percentage of the land base that it is. And so if you look at the treaties that have been settled, there haven't been any expropriations to settle any of those treaties. Nobody who was living on a private house was up and against their will removed from that area. There were certain leases that were dealt with in certain instances and so on at different points in time, but there's simply no history of that at all. But in terms of people who argue their own versions of land back, it's equivalent to people arguing what freedom means. And there will be people that will argue that freedom means that there shouldn't be any government anywhere at all telling them to stop doing anything they want to do at all. Do those people exist? Of course they do. Is that where society is? Is that where the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is? Absolutely not. But are there people that have that view? Of course there are. Are there people who argue around land back that it's a very robust process and might go way beyond any of the processes that anybody in any official capacity is contemplating or pursuing at this point in time? Of course there are people there. But the fact that there are some people who sometimes talk about freedom in a way that goes well beyond what would be considered acceptable in Canadian society is no different from the fact that there would be some people that would argue about land back in a way that goes well beyond anywhere that we're likely to go. But if you look at the processes that are in place, if you look at the serious conversations that are going on, every single one of those conversations is being done on a respectful, constructive basis, and it recognizes what the Supreme Court has always said and what every single First Nation, Inuit, and Métis group I've ever worked with has ever said, which is we're all here to stay. And it's based on that principle that the negotiation starts.
Let's talk about more on the brighter side. What are the success stories that we can say? So let's say the examples of successful co-management or self-governance that others can learn about.
Well, I would certainly start with the modern treaties that we have in British Columbia and what they've been able to achieve for not only their citizens, but for the entire region. And you have Tlaiamin up in Powell River that is successfully implementing their treaty. Tsawwassen, who is an economic powerhouse, but really that's been integral and important for Tsawwassen is putting their children and elders first. And so they built an incredible youth center. So they have places to gather, they have places and safe spaces to go to. Same with elders, and they're in the center of their community. And so, really showcasing and highlighting how important this intergenerational connection is, because as we mentioned previously, those connections have been broken. And so they're really rebuilding how their community operates and how they continue to connect. Same with the Monooth Five Nations that are implementing their treaty in different regions on Vancouver Island. So you have Toquat that is engaged in land use planning, wanting to prepare for additional housing at home. So again, local solutions for their community. Revitalization of culture and language has been integral to all. Hawaiiat, who's also opened a mother center in Port Alberni. So again, putting women and children at the center and the heart of who they are, as well as Ukulitha. So working on their self-governance building, again, managing the resources that they have, as well as bolstering the tourism industry. And that's the same with Cayuga Chuckleset. They're very heavily focused on tourism, but it's about tourism and their cultural knowledge and awareness and providing their distinct and unique history along with those that are touring in their area. So again, creating bridges of understanding. And I think that's really meaningful and important, as well as if we talked about Hawaiian earlier, who is, the little engine that is, booming along. I think there's been a lot of discussion in the news recently around the forest fire and how their community came together to support everyone. And working well with their local municipalities. I think that's another really important feature. So not only do they have these broad aspirations of independence and prosperity and self-determination, and they're self-governing, but they also understand the needs of the people, and they're able to put forward their ideas and their visions and make decisions in very timely ways to ensure that they have better, brighter futures for all. And it's about creating that better, brighter future for all.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to just add another side to that too. April 17th, 1982 was a very important moment in Canadian history. And it was the moment at which the British Parliament could no longer make decisions about Canada's constitution. And whether or not they ever were going to make another one, and whether or not we were going to make any changes after that, it mattered very importantly in the nature of this country that any decisions about Canada would be made by Canadians in Canada, not by a foreign parliament. And there's an analogy here. Celeste has talked about a whole bunch of examples of really important things. But for those of us who haven't lived under the reality that something as basic as whether or not there was going to be a gas station in my community, having to go through a bunch of federal public servants thousands of kilometers away who had never even visited and were never going to visit my community in certain probabilities, the fact that that can never happen again, the fact that you know that that can never happen again, the fact that you know it will be you and your community that will decide whether or not there will be a gas station, whether or not there ever is a gas station, is in and of itself an enormously different thing. You're not going to get a gas station because somebody you don't know and will never meet decided that it met their criteria for you having a gas station. And it sounds like a relatively small thing, but only if you've never had to fight that struggle.
Exactly.
And lost it time and time and time again. And if you have had to fight that struggle, if you've had to take that struggle on just to get some of the raw basics, time and time and time and time again, and know that you never have to do that again, that is an enormous asset. And that is where we've unleashed, I think, a lot of opportunity and a lot of energy that used to go into struggles that really weren't that productive, and allowed them to actually let communities focus on the things that matter to them.
What are some resources that people can either go online or find it within their proximity about truth and reconciliation that can help them understand what it is in a meaningful way. I think one thing that personally helped me a lot was that a close family of mine started working for the Squamish Nation. And then we learned a lot about the Squamish Nation. So that engagement, that could be one resource, but I was wondering what you can tell us about maybe a new library or a new resource that's out there that can people go and learn about what truth and reconciliation is for themselves.
Well, you can certainly head to our website, bctreaty.ca. We have an interactive map. So you put in where you're located and you'll find out the nations that are surrounding your area. But also at UBC, you have the library that is there specifically for First Nations, or I guess it's Indigenous. And you're able to provide and access incredible resources and support through UBC, as well as I would suggest looking at the TRC's website and the human rights aspects of what it really means about truth and reconciliation. As well, I believe that there's the courses through Alberta that you're able to access for free, and it's about learning part of the history. There's a lot of resources out there. You just throw things in Google and you'll find it.
And I think too, I would add to that, there's a lot of stuff out there now. When Celeste and I first started doing these things, there was literally nothing that you could find anywhere. And now there's a lot. But I would add to all the excellent suggestions that Celeste has mentioned, go to your local library and ask them what they've got. And more importantly, if they tell you don't have a whole lot, ask them why not. This is the journey in reconciliation. Like I said, I didn't get 15 minutes of education on Indigenous, and Celeste has reminded me, and I've talked about this in a bunch of my speeches, probably half of that was about Riel, and the thing that I remember is that they hanged him at the end, right? Like that was seen as a good thing in the classroom story that, you put up a rebellion against the government, we'll hang you, and we'll teach everybody. That was what I learned about Indigenous growing up in this country all the way through university. So when you get to your library, if they've got some good stuff, well, read it. Go through it, see it, watch it, whatever the medium is. If they don't, ask them why. Talk to your local city councilor. Say, listen, what are we doing in my town in the world of reconciliation? Who are we working with? And in a bunch of cases, when I talk to people, how many of you have visited a First Nation, Inuit, or a Métis community? How many of you have gone to their visitor reception center if they've got one? How many of you have gone to their website? You wouldn't believe the small percentage of people that say they've done that. And if the local First Nation has a visitor center, has information, read it. Find out what's going there. Go and visit if there is a place to go and visit. Even if it's just a restaurant, go and have a meal in the restaurant in that community, because we have a history of not visiting them. We have a history of being afraid to go there. It's too different. We're not really sure. We're not sure if we're welcome, and all of those things. And it's that separation that is a key ingredient to the reasons why we need reconciliation in the first place. So to all of those excellent things that Celeste has said, I would just add that.
Path forward for Canada, and that circles back to the education part that you mentioned, Celeste. How can we have reconciliation be part of the education system for our next generation, so that the only thing that they remember would not be that the Riel was actually hanged at the end of the day? So that negative connotation around First Nations, specific to that example, would be changed to, hey, there was a history here. We have to learn about it. And then that in and of itself, I think will help a lot uh, 10, 15 years down the road when it comes to the conversation around truth and reconciliation.
I don't disagree at all. And I think that working in partnership with the local First Nation and the school district, and whether the First Nation has its own school, but sharing that information and building it into the curriculum is integral to learning and teaching. And I know some jurisdictions, like for instance, Manitoba and Saskatchewan actually have really good treaty education, and they built all the modules that is easy for the school districts to adapt and train their teachers to teach the history in their classes based on what has been created. And I think replicating that and learning from those that have created that curriculum, as you know, there's so many different opportunities to learn and to teach and to train. But back to what Danielle was saying around go and visit the community. If there's is there an information center or is there an interpretation center? Go on like set up a high school or middle school or elementary school trip and do some of that connection and bonding and sharing, and over a meal is even perfect, but there's so many different ways. But I do think that education is what's going to get us out of this mess, the mess that we've all inherited and some of us have created. And that's what we're going to have to invest in is education. But it's a reciprocal education too. I think there's a lot that we are able to learn from each other, from different cultures, from different perspectives, and I think that's what makes our communities and our country just amazing. And we have such an incredible future as long as we're sort of trying to paddle in the same canoe together.
Anything else from you, Daniel?
I agree wholeheartedly with what Celeste said, which is probably the wisest thing I've said all day.
Thank you so much, both of you. I truly appreciate the time. I wish we had Catherine as well. I'm sure she could have contributed to this conversation as well. Just one last thing before we wrap this up. We don't have anything in terms of education or curriculum like that in BC, do we? You're muted.
It's not great. They've
I don't
updated
know it
it.
well enough. Yeah.
And there is a mandatory course now that all graduates must take, which is, I would say, like a 101,
Mhm.
which is a good start, but it's, again, this larger global perspective versus local, your own community
True.
perspective as well. So, yeah.
And I'll just add to that, reconciliation needs to happen locally. You can't have reconciliation in theory and have it fail in local practice. And I think that's why it's so critical that people learn about what happened in their backyards.
Mhm.
So, the history of why, for example, in the Lower Mainland, the reserves are where they are today, because they weren't always where they are today, is a long history. And it matters that people understand that history. And it matters that people understand what was in place before the reserves, because that was a wildly different story. And if you understand that history, you don't buy into the questions about, well, why, are they corrupt or not? Why don't they pay taxes? Why do they get everything from the, you don't accept those ridiculous stories anywhere near as easily if you understand what happened in your own community in previous generations. And that's why I think that education is going to be critical. I think I'm correctly quoting the late Murray Sinclair when he said, education is what created this situation, and it will be education that gets us out of this situation.
Thank you so much, both of you. I truly appreciate your time. Uh, Sort of on time. We're finishing things. And yeah, next episode that we'll be having is going to be on labor policy with everything that's going on. So see you. And
Great.
Well as I would suggest looking at the TRC's website and the human rights aspects of what it really means about truth and reconciliation as well. I believe that there's the courses through Alberta that you're able to access
Mm.
for free, and it's about learning part of the history. There's a lot of resources out there. You just throw things in Google and you'll find it.
And I
and
think too, I would add to that, there's a lot of stuff out there now. When Celeste and I first started doing these things, there was literally nothing that you could find anywhere. And now there's a lot. But I would add to all the excellent suggestions that Celeste has mentioned, go to your local library and ask them what they've got. And more importantly, if they tell you you don't have a whole lot, ask them why not. This is the journey in reconciliation. Like I said, I didn't get 15 minutes of education on Indigenous, and Celeste has reminded me, and I've talked about this in a bunch of my speeches. Probably half of that was about Riel, and the thing that I remember is that they hanged him at the end, right? Like and that was seen as a good thing in the classroom story that, you put up a rebellion against the government, we'll hang you, and we'll teach everybody. That was what I learned about Indigenous growing up in this country, all the way through university. So when you get to your library, if they've got some good stuff, well, read it, go through it, see it, watch it, whatever the medium is. If they don't, ask them why. Talk to your local city councilor. Say, listen, what are we doing in my town in the world of reconciliation? Who are we working with? And in a bunch of cases, when I talk to people, how many of you have visited a First Nation, Inuit, or a Métis community? How many of you have gone to their visitor reception center if they've got one? How many of you have gone to their website? You wouldn't believe the small percentage of people that say they've done that. And if the local First Nation has a visitor center, has information, read it. Find out what's going there. Go and visit if there is a place to go and visit. Even if it's just a restaurant, go and have a meal in the restaurant in that community, because we have a history of not visiting them. We have a history of being afraid to go there. It's too different. We're not really sure. We're not sure if we're welcome, and all of those things. And it's that separation that is a key ingredient to the reasons why we need reconciliation in the first place. So to all of those excellent things that Celeste has said, I would just add that.
path forward for Canada, and that circles back to the education part that you mentioned, Celeste. How can we have reconciliation be part of the education system for our next generation, so that the only thing that they remember would not be that the was actually hanged at the end of the day? So that that negative connotation around First Nations, specific to that example, would be changed to, hey, there was a history here. We have to learn about it. And then that in and of itself, I think will help a lot uh, 10, 15 years down the road when it comes to the conversation around truth and reconciliation.
I don't disagree at all. And I think that working in partnership with the local First Nation and the school district, and whether the First Nation has its own school, but sharing that information and building it into the curriculum is integral to learning and teaching. And I know some jurisdictions, like for instance, Manitoba and Saskatchewan actually have really good treaty education, and they built all the modules that is easy for the school districts to adapt and train their teachers to teach the history in their classes based on what has been created. And I think replicating that and learning from those that have created that curriculum, as you know, and there's so many different opportunities to learn and to teach and to train. But back to what Danielle was saying around go and visit the community. If there's is there an information center or is there an interpretation center? Go on like set up a high school or middle school or elementary school trip and do some of
Mhm.
that connection and bonding and sharing and over a meal is even perfect, but there's so many different ways. But I do think that education is what's going to get us out of this mess, the mess that we've all inherited and some of us have created. And that's what we're going to have to invest in is education. But it's a reciprocal education too, I think. There's a lot that we are able to learn from each other, from different cultures, from different perspectives. And I think that's what makes our communities and our country just amazing. And we have such an incredible future as long as we're sort of trying to paddle in the same canoe together.
Anything else from you, Daniel?
I agree wholeheartedly with what Celeste said, which is probably the wisest thing I've said all day.
Thank you so much, both of you. I truly appreciate the time. I wish we had Catherine as well. I'm sure she could have contributed to this conversation as well. Just one last thing before we wrap this up. We don't have anything in terms of education or curriculum like that in BC, do we? You're muted.
It's not great. They've
I don't
updated
know it
it,
well enough. Yeah.
and there is a mandatory course now that all graduates must take, which is, I would say, like a 101,
Hmm.
which is a good start, but it's, again, this larger global perspective versus local, your own community
True.
perspective as well. So, yeah.
And I'll just add to that, reconciliation needs to happen locally. You can't have reconciliation in theory and have it fail in local practice. And I think that's why it's so critical that people learn about what happened in their backyards.
Hmm.
So, the history of why, for example, in the Lower Mainland, the reserves are where they are today, because they weren't always where they are today, is a long history. And it matters that people understand that history. And it matters that people understand what was in place before their reserves, because that was a wildly different story. And if you understand that history, you don't buy into the questions about, well, why, are they corrupt or not? Why don't they pay taxes? Why do they get everything for the? You don't accept those ridiculous stories anywhere near as easily if you understand what happened in your own community in previous generations. And that's why I think that education is going to be critical. I think I'm correctly quoting the late Murray Sinclair when he said, education is what created this situation, and it will be education that gets us out of this situation.
Thank you so much, both of you. I truly appreciate your time. Uh, Sort of on time. We're finishing things. And yeah, next episode that we'll be having is going to be on labor policy with everything that's going on. So see you.
All
And
right.